My daughter Emily wanted to do this parent swap thing to see what it was like to have different parents. So she went to stay with her classmate, and her classmate, a boy named Kevin, came to stay with me. I helped Kevin with his homework, made him cut down on his video game time, and even helped him make a study schedule. But at the end of the day, Kevin looked at me seriously and said, "Mr. Johnson, you're so old-fashioned. You're still using parenting styles from like 100 years ago. Emily is really unlucky to have you as her dad." What I didn't expect was that when Emily came home, she complained too. She said, "You're not as handsome as Mr. Garcia, and you don't spoil me or get me like he does. Mom's right, you're not a good dad." I thought about it and decided to try to be more like Kevin's dad, Mr. Garcia. I thought maybe Emily would like that better. But even after I tried to change, she still didn't like me. Later, I got really sick because I was so stressed trying to balance work and taking care of the family. I asked Emily for some money to help with the hospital bills, but she just gave me this cold look and said, "You're old already, you've lived long enough. Why waste money on you?" I gave the money to Mr. Garcia to hire a helper. You can figure it out yourself. I was so heartbroken that I died. But then I woke up, and it was like I had gone back in time. Now, Kevin was trying to teach me how to be a dad. He said, "Even though you've only been my dad for a day, I've had enough. How can there be such a boring dad like you in this world?" My dad is awesome. He gives me freedom, never makes me feel bad. I can do whatever I want. It's not like you, who controls everything and limits this and that. 13-year-old Kevin rolled his eyes and added, "Emily is so unlucky to have a dad like you. Luckily, she met me. This is a guide I wrote for you. Here." Kevin, just like before, gave me a little handwritten book. The cover said, "A Guide to Being a Father." In my first life, when I heard those words, I really doubted myself. Because from the outside, my relationship with Emily was always tense, and I couldn't help but wonder if my way of parenting was really the problem. But my whole mess started with that book. After I married my wife, Sarah, she quit her job. She said, "When you marry a man, you marry his money and support." And she didn't want to keep working so hard after we got married. I was okay with it, because I had a good job, so supporting the family wasn't too hard financially. But after I started changing my parenting style based on that book, I found myself working harder and harder every day, year after year. At home, I had to take perfect care of Emily and give her emotional support. I was like a machine in the house, always running. After all that work raising her, she secretly ran off with some guy with dyed hair and got pregnant. After being dumped, she decided to go abroad, saying she would become an independent woman and make the guy regret what he did. The guy, meanwhile, was living it up, while I, the gullible dad, had to work even harder to send her a lot of money every month. Later, she came back to the country, but she rarely contacted me. I thought that maybe she didn't say it, but she was probably still grateful to me deep down. But when I asked her for money to pay for my hospital bills, she said sarcastically, "How pathetic are you? You've lived 75 years and can't even find $1,000 for medical bills? Look at Mr. Garcia. He lived a carefree life, and even as an old man, he doesn't have any health problems. Unlike you, always complaining about this pain or that. Having a dad like you is just bad luck." I was left at the hospital entrance, and I sat there for a whole day. Thinking back on my life, I finally realized she had hated me all along. I don't know where things went wrong. Was it when I sacrificed my health to save money for her to buy dolls? Or when I gave up my hobbies and self-respect just to please her and her mother? Now I get it. It doesn't matter what the answer is anymore. What matters is that I get to live again. This time I'm going to live for myself. I threw the booklet aside and picked up Kevin's bags. He was shocked and asked, "Mr. Johnson, what are you going to do?" I smiled a little and said, "I'm not a good father, so I definitely can't teach you anything. It's better to send you back so I don't waste your time." He opened his mouth, but he couldn't think of anything to say. His house was in the same neighborhood as mine, so it didn't take long to get there. When I opened the door, Mr. Garcia was letting Emily ride on his shoulders, and she was happily eating ice cream. Kevin got mad right away, walked in without even taking his shoes off, grabbed the ice cream from Emily's hand, and shouted, "Why are you eating my ice cream? Why are you bossing my dad around?" "Your dad is over there. Go away." Emily looked at Mr. Garcia with a sad expression, and she didn't even look at me. Mr. Garcia sighed and gently said to Kevin, "Isn't today the parent swap day? Why are you back?" Emily proudly said, "Yeah, Kevin, according to the rules, he's my dad today. Your dad is over there." She pointed at me, her voice full of dislike. Kevin got even more disgusted. He stomped his foot and shouted, "My dad isn't like that. That's your dad. You two look exactly alike." Emily couldn't answer. Her eyes turned red, her lips were tightly pressed together, and her face turned bright red. The next second she yelled angrily, "I don't want that kind of dad. I want someone like your dad to be my dad." Tears ran down her face. Mr. Garcia looked at me apologetically. He said, "Mr. Johnson, don't take the kid's silly words to heart. How about this? Let her stay with us today, and when she calms down, I'll send her back." I had gone through something similar before. Back then, because I was possessive and wanted to prove I could also be a good father, I forced Emily to come back with me. After thinking about it, I tried to follow Mr. Garcia's way of spoiling her. But Emily kept a grumpy face towards me the whole time, ignoring anything I said. She even secretly told her mom that I was a fake father, a wolf in sheep's clothing, pretending to be good when deep inside, I was nothing but bad. The insults were awful. What could I say in response? Since they said that, wasn't it my fault for not doing more? So this time, if I spoil her again, I'll end up regretting it. I smiled and said, "Then I'll leave it to you. She can stay as long as she wants, as long as you don't mind." All three of them were wide-eyed. Kevin, needless to say, was furious. Emily was surprised. Mr. Garcia's expression became complicated, a flicker of unhappiness crossing his eyes before he quickly covered it up with his polite attitude. He asked, "Isn't this a bit inappropriate?" I turned to Emily and asked, "Do you think it's okay?" Emily looked eagerly at Mr. Garcia and said, "Can I stay with Mr. Garcia for the rest of my life?" Mr. Garcia paused for a moment, then smiled and said, "Of course." He glanced at me, seemingly expecting me to stop her. I sneered and turned to leave. Since they like each other so much, let them be. This weekend, Emily didn't come home. Suddenly, I had a lot of free time. I could casually hang out with my friends, drinking and eating barbecue, eating and drinking whatever I wanted, and then going to an internet cafe to stay up all night playing games. I didn't have to worry about whether Emily had finished her homework, and I didn't have to get up early to drive her to school. I slept until 3 p.m., ordered takeout, opened a can of beer, and stretched my legs while watching a game, enjoying a lazy afternoon. I saw a new game I'd been waiting for a long time and immediately ordered the collector's edition. At this point, I hadn't given up on myself. In my spare time, I still wrote articles online to earn some extra money. In my previous life, all that money went to Emily and Sarah. Later, Sarah complained that I didn't spend enough time with her, so I had to give up that part-time job. From then on, all my free time outside of work went into providing what they called emotional value to Sarah and Emily. Now it felt really good to get that back. While I was in the internet cafe, playing games with my buddies, Sarah's video call suddenly came through. As soon as the screen appeared, I saw Emily's face was bruised. Sarah angrily questioned me. "Where have you been? Not even answering the phone. Look at what happened to our daughter. Are you just going to ignore it? What use are you in this house?" I raised an eyebrow and asked Emily, "Weren't you at Mr. Garcia's house? Who dared to hit you?" Emily pouted and said, "Who else but Kevin?" I nodded. "Then you must have done something to make him angry." She snapped and said, "All I did was call him Dad. Does he really need to hit me?" I asked, "Didn't Mr. Garcia stop him?" Emily's eyes suddenly turned red, and she wiped her tears, not saying a word. I became suspicious and said, "Could it be that Mr. Garcia just let him hit you? Well, what's the point of pretending not to be biased toward his own son?" Sarah interrupted me. "Don't use your dirty thinking to judge Robert. He's always polite and gentlemanly. He would never be biased." Here we go again. Every time I questioned Robert's kind-hearted persona, Sarah was the first to defend him. My daughter, under her subtle influence, firmly believed Robert was the perfect father. But she forgot that all of her comfort and lack of worries were given to her through my hard work. Robert's concern was all talk, and aside from the parent swap day, my daughter had never really spent time with him. But this time, without my interference, my daughter stayed at Robert's house for 3 days. What happened during that time, I don't know. All I know is that now she doesn't echo Sarah's words like she used to. Instead, she just hangs her head in disappointment. Sarah furrowed her brows and said to me, "Emily's in such a bad state. I think the person who tied the knot should untie it. How about I take her to stay with us for a couple of days, let the conflict settle, and then bring her back? After all, you're not home." Before she could start her usual round of persuasion, I quickly interrupted her. "Sure, hope you two have fun." Both of them were shocked. Sarah asked uncertainly, "Are you serious?" I waved my hand dismissively. "Yes, really, don't dawdle. I have business to attend to." I swiftly hung up the video call and went back to my game. In my previous life, on the afternoon when my daughter abandoned me at the hospital door, I thought about many things. At one point, I suddenly woke up. I remembered when I gave Emily her name, Sarah had suggested calling her Ji Teng Tung, and I realized from the very beginning I have already lost. My entire life had been spent trying to grasp something I could never hold, something that would never stay for me. Since I couldn't catch it, I decided not to try anymore. When I returned home, Sarah deliberately pointed to the black swan cake on the table. She said, "Robert specially bought this for you. Look how good he is to you. He's a single father. It's hard enough to take care of his child and earn money, and yet he often brings you gifts. You should help him out more in the future, all right?" I stared at the cake and couldn't help but laugh. From the moment Robert appeared, he had always acted so sincere and warm. He would respectfully call me Mr. Johnson, and often brought food and drinks. But who buys a man a black swan cake just for no reason? Those snacks and drinks were clearly leftovers from his trip with Sarah. I nodded in response to Sarah. "I see he really likes Emily, and Emily wants him to be her dad. How about we let Emily stay there? They can be companions, and she can just call him a godfather." Sarah was stunned. She immediately stood up and said, "George, when did you become so generous? Do you have someone else outside?" "You used to be so concerned about Emily. If she didn't come back for a while, you'd be out searching for her. Now you're actually willing to let her stay at someone else's house?" I smiled. "Robert isn't just anyone. Isn't he the one you trust most?" Sarah was speechless. A moment later, she asked, "Where have you been the last couple of days? Did you go see an ex-girlfriend?" She furrowed her brows, pouting, and grabbed my phone to check my spending history. If the old me had seen this, I would have thought she really cared about me. But now, I just found it ridiculous. After looking through it, she let out a sigh of relief, rolled her eyes, and looked at me with disgust. "You're already a father, and yet you're still playing games at an internet cafe? How childish. This is the last time. You can't do that again." Then, she suddenly got busy cleaning. Someone once said that when a person feels guilty, they tend to stay busy. That's exactly what Sarah was doing now. While wiping the table, she said, "Emily is a girl, after all, and there are some things Robert can't take care of." I interrupted her. "Fine, you can go ahead." She widened her eyes, pursed her lips, and hurriedly said, "Robert and I are just simple friends. Don't overthink it. With the kids around, we won't do anything. Even if the kids aren't around, we wouldn't do anything." Her eagerness to explain was really laughable. But in my previous life, I never saw this side of her. Because back then, I had tried to catch evidence of her cheating, but every time I failed. She even turned the tables and accused me of being the controlling one, saying she was an independent woman and had every right to her privacy. Now I didn't care, but she was the one getting nervous. What a sight. I will never forget that day when, at 75 years old, I discovered she had gone on a trip with Robert. She said to me, "We were just looking at the scenery, watching the snow. We never even held hands. It's always been like that. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have so many regrets in this life." She thought that by controlling her physical contact with Robert, she was being loyal to me. Every time my daughter stood by her, accusing me, she said, "Robert is Mom's first love. If it weren't for your existence, they would have gotten back together long ago. You've monopolized Mom's life. Now that Mom is nice to Robert, what's wrong with that?" I'd had enough of those days. After they moved out, I packed my things and returned to my hometown. During this time, my daughter posted 3 tweets. She wrote, "Finally, God sent me my real dad. Kevin is so annoying. Robert isn't just his dad. Had another fight with Kevin today. My real dad must have died. Not even a call from him." Not long after Robert called me, he said, "Mr. Johnson, Emily misses you. Come back soon?" His voice was filled with exhaustion, as if he couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't respond to him and only returned home the day before New Year's Eve. I didn't tell Sarah I was coming back. As soon as I opened the door, I saw Sarah and Robert sitting together, making dumplings. Emily was sitting on the side, mixing the filling, smiling at Robert and asking, "Dad, do you think I mixed the filling well?" Just as Robert was about to answer, he saw me standing at the door. He stood up in a panic and awkwardly explained, "Mr. Johnson, please don't misunderstand. Emily meant to call me her godfather." Sarah also asked, blushing, "Why did you suddenly come back?" I asked in return, "Where's Kevin?" Emily quickly answered, "Brother is always jealous of me. After breaking my things, he ran off. He's probably waiting for Robert to find him, but I believe Robert isn't the type to be biased." Robert forced a smile and tried to stay calm, though I could tell he was anxious. I knew full well that he had been sending me messages every day, subtly urging me to come back quickly, clearly unable to handle Emily anymore. In the manual written by Kevin, he described Robert as a gentleman who was calm, composed, and always the good guy. But the truth was, he wasn't without temper. He just hid it well. No matter how great an actor one is, everyone has their limits. I raised an eyebrow, pretending not to care. "Oh, so the kid I saw earlier was really Kevin?" Robert immediately stood up, asking, "What happened to him?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Looks like he's hanging out with a few troublemakers." Robert's face changed instantly. He was about to leave, but was stopped by Sarah, who grabbed his sleeve. Sarah bit her lip and said, "He's 13 now. He'll come back when he cools down. If you go out now, it will just fuel his temper. Besides, you promised Emily you'd make dumplings with her." Robert's face showed visible concern, unable to hide his worry. Emily also grabbed his hand, emphasizing, "Godfather, you promised to make dumplings with me. And this time it's Kevin's fault. You can't leave." I couldn't help but laugh. "Sweetheart, that's not right. Robert is just showing bias toward his own son. What's wrong with that?" Emily yelled at me, "Robert won't be biased. He's not like that. He spoils me the most." With that praise, Robert slowly sat back down. I silently took a picture of them and posted it online. 15 minutes later, Kevin kicked the door open. He knocked the whole table of dumplings over and hit Emily on the head with a rolling pin. Emily wasn't fast enough to avoid it, clutching her head and crying out in pain. Almost simultaneously, Sarah slapped Kevin across the face and grabbed his collar, about to slap him again. Robert shouted, What are you doing?" Sarah gritted her teeth. "You saw it yourself. From start to finish, it was Kevin causing trouble. If I don't do something, he'll just get worse and more arrogant." Robert was furious. He shoved her away, growling. "But that doesn't give you the right to hit my son. And look at what kind of daughter you raised, always stirring up trouble with my son, following me around like a shadow. Isn't it annoying? Don't you have any manners?" He then turned to me and shot me a cold look. "As her biological father, don't you feel ashamed?" I shrugged and smiled. "If my daughter doesn't like me and prefers you, what can I do about it? Should I act like the obedient daughter's slave you talk about in your manual, always circling around her? A simp? I'd rather divorce than be a simp." Robert's eyes lit up. Almost simultaneously, Sarah's eyes also showed a glint. Because I had once said, no matter what, I would never divorce Sarah, and I was resolute about it. That's why they did everything they could to irritate me. In my past life, I was very conflicted. No matter how much they disgusted me, I wouldn't divorce. This time I gave him exactly what he wanted. He momentarily forgot that Kevin was still on the floor, crying in pain. After a pause, he helped the boy up. In a pretense of politeness, he said, "Mr. Johnson, I didn't mean it like that. Don't throw mud at me. You and your wife should sort out your issues yourselves. I'll leave now." Before he left, he shared a deep look with Sarah. My daughter's behavior was even more interesting. After he said all that to her, she actually ran over to stop him, saying, "Robert, don't leave. You promised to make dumplings with me." Robert quickly hid the disgust in his eyes, smiling. "I'll come back after you two sort things out." Emily pursed her lips and nodded. My daughter couldn't see the disdain in Robert's eyes. If he really became her stepfather, Emily's good days would be over. After Robert and his son left, Sarah began to sigh and mutter to herself. She shot me a reproachful look and said, "Recently you're hardly ever home. Where have you been off to, enjoying yourself?" I calmly replied, "Your husband has been missing for half a month, and now you're asking me. Isn't that a little late? What were you doing all that time? I wasn't home, and you didn't even bother to call me." Her pupils dilated, her cheeks flushed, and a guilty look crossed her face. At that moment, Emily coldly remarked, "Why are you so angry? You're such a male chauvinist. No wonder no one ever likes you. Unlike Robert, he would never act like you." I sneered. "How long have you been living with a stepfather? You've already figured it out so well. Maybe in time you'll realize that I'm actually the best father you could have." She rolled her eyes and said, "Stop being shameless. If we weren't related by blood, I wouldn't even want to call you Dad." She got more and more agitated and suddenly screamed, "You're just a useless extra in this family. Can't you just leave and know your place?" I turned to Sarah and asked, "Do you think the same?" She lowered her gaze, furrowing her brow. She said, "George, you know I've never done anything to hurt you. I wanted to live happily with you, but as a mother, I believe a child's physical and mental health is more important than anything." I nodded. "That's true. In that case, let's get a divorce." She froze. She was as still as a statue. Even Emily was stunned, and her anger evaporated immediately. Sarah said, "Don't tease us." I smiled. "I'm not joking about something like this." Emily became excited and said to Sarah, "Mom, hurry up and draft the agreement. Otherwise, he might change his mind." Sarah frowned and softly scolded her. "Don't speak carelessly. We'll talk about this later." Sarah was always like this, acting like a saint while wanting to have it all. But an hour later, she handed me the agreement. She said, "For Emily's sake, we'll temporarily divorce. When she's better, we can remarry." I skimmed through the agreement and tossed it aside. I said, "Regarding the asset distribution, this isn't right." She frowned. "What's wrong with it?" I spoke directly. "By law, you've used the money I earned to support your brother's living expenses all these years. The house you bought for your parents back home without telling me has to be factored in. And I also found out that you've secretly loaned money to Robert to buy a car these past few months. This money also needs to be added to the distribution." Her face went pale, and she stared at me, dumbfounded. Embarrassment and discomfort flooded her face. In the end, realizing she was in the wrong, she agreed to my proposed asset distribution, and I took most of the wealth. On the first day back to work after the New Year, we went to file for divorce, entering a 30-day cooling-off period. When I packed up and was about to leave, Robert came to see me off. He put on a guilty expression and said, "Mr. Johnson, I didn't expect this outcome. I'm truly sorry." I smiled faintly. "If you two get married, please take good care of my daughter. Don't let her suffer." Robert nodded. "Of course. I treat all children equally, with no favoritism." Sarah snorted and pretended to scold me. "George, what are you talking about? Robert and I don't have the kind of relationship you think. Lending him money is just mutual help between friends, nothing more. Don't overthink it." Such a hypocrite. I couldn't be bothered to argue with her and turned to leave. From now on, everything here is none of my business. But what I didn't expect, Sarah suddenly started messaging me frequently. The day after the divorce, Sarah texted me, complaining that Kevin was rude and that as soon as he moved into the new place, he started fighting with Emily over the room. On the third day, she complained again, saying it was tiring to take care of 2 children, especially one who wasn't even her biological child. By the 5th day, her messages began questioning Robert. She said, "Both kids are asking him for help with their homework. Emily truly doesn't know, but Kevin pretends not to understand to seek attention. He actually let Emily do it on her own. He wasn't like this before." I didn't reply. Every day I was out enjoying myself with a few good buddies, playing ball at the court after work, sweating it out, taking a shower, and then heading to an internet cafe for some gaming. I was living the kind of carefree life, with no time to deal with these issues. Unexpectedly, on Lantern Festival, Sarah called me directly. She opened the conversation with more complaints, saying, "Every year I go back to my hometown for Lantern Festival. Emily misses her grandparents. But just as we were about to leave, I found out that Robert only bought Emily a ticket to her grandparents' house and expected me to go with him and his son to his place." She sounded wronged. Now Emily's really upset. Before she could finish, Emily grabbed the phone from her. She said, "Dad, how could he do this to me? When I changed dads, he treated me so well." I was speechless and replied, "You chose your dad yourself, so there must be some misunderstanding. Just go and act a little cute, and it'll all be fine." With a teary voice, she asked, "Dad, can't you just not divorce? Before you divorced, Robert was really good to me." I sneered inwardly. As expected, a thankless person is still a thankless person. Don't expect her to truly regret her actions. I remained calm and answered leisurely, "I can't do that." Then I hung up the phone. When they tried to call again, I didn't answer. Instead, I quietly forwarded the messages Sarah had sent me, as well as the recording of the phone call, to Robert. Robert lost his composure. He angrily texted back, "Now that you're divorced, why are you still pretending with me? Trying to turn things around during the cooling-off period. Dream on. Don't think Sarah is mad at me. If I just flatter her a little, she'll be back in my arms." He still didn't understand Sarah. Sarah is a little fairy, as she likes to call herself. An independent woman who loves herself the most. How could someone like her be willing to follow her husband back to his family's home? Bearing the guilt of neglecting her daughter? Sure enough, from what I saw posted on social media, it ended up with the father and son compromising and going with Sarah to her parents' home. The next day, my former brother-in-law told me that a good show was unfolding at home. My father-in-law, to test whether Robert was a good enough stepfather, deliberately favored Emily, repeatedly embarrassing Kevin. Robert, eager to show loyalty to his future father-in-law and reassure him about Sarah, chose to temporarily favor Emily, neglecting Kevin multiple times. My brother-in-law overheard Robert telling Kevin to hold on for another month and that everything would be fine once the cooling-off period ended. But not long after, Kevin came to find me. When he found me, he was holding a phone, recording a video, and shouted at the camera, calling me Dad. "Dad, I finally found you!" I smiled and asked, "Are you sure you've got the right person?" He shrugged indifferently and said, "Anyway, since the day I changed dads, I've never changed back. From today on, you're my dad." Clearly, this was an act of rebellion, using me to provoke Robert. I sneered, "Sorry, I don't want a son like you." He quickly changed his expression and blocked my path, asking, "You have nothing left now, and I'm the only one willing to be close to you. What gives you the right to reject me?" I replied slowly, "I have money, I have free time, and I have my beloved career, and my parents who raised me. I'm content." He froze for a moment, gritted his teeth, and said, "But you've lost your wife and daughter. They are the most important people in your life." I was speechless. I said, "You may have misunderstood. It's not because they are my wife and daughter that they're automatically important to me. It's the people I truly value who are important. No matter what your identity is, it doesn't make you automatically important. Parents raise their children without thought. Children grow up and forget their parents. And husbands and wives marry but live separate lives. Do you think they find each other important?" He cried and yelled at me, "I don't care. Go get my sister back. Don't let her keep taking my dad." I spread my hands and said, "That's not something I can control. What can I do? Your dad is just that amazing, and my daughter depends on him so much." Suddenly, he grabbed my hand, and with an almost pleading tone, he pressed, "No, she took my dad, so I'm going to take her dad. You have to treat me the way you treat him." I sighed and said, "How exactly do you want me to treat you?" He said, "Just follow the dad guide I wrote." Hearing his entitled tone, I almost laughed. I raised an eyebrow and nodded. "All right. Since you're still young, I'll take care of you for a few days. But let me be clear, I'm not your dad, and I won't follow your guide. If you want to stay with me, you'll have to follow my rules." He was silent for a few seconds, then slowly nodded. I smiled helplessly. I arranged a room for him, set up a study plan, made sure his meals were nutritious, helped with homework, and then took him out to relax. Whether it was playing games, going to an amusement park, skiing, eating good food, or buying fun things, I treated him the way I used to treat my own children. The difference was that while my daughter often refused to do things with me because she felt there was a generational gap, Kevin had no choice but to go along with whatever I suggested. My daughter always thought I was an old-fashioned relic who couldn't understand the ideas of the new generation, so she rejected any invitation to hang out with me. Even when I bought 2 tickets to see her favorite celebrity, she'd ask if I could go alone because she didn't want to be embarrassed in front of her classmates. Honestly, that really bothered me. But taking Kevin out to experience these activities gave me a new kind of feeling. The first day, he was still frowning, constantly checking his phone as if waiting for someone's message. By the second and third days, he started to smile more. He was fairly average in many ways, but he had an extraordinary confidence. Even if his grades were terrible, he would comfort himself by saying he was a late bloomer, destined to surprise everyone. When he almost had an accident skiing, and I had to save him, he claimed he was the child of good fortune. Then he said to me, "Mr. Johnson, I didn't expect you to be so amazing, skiing so well." If I wasn't mistaken, for the first time, I saw a hint of admiration in his eyes. I taught him skiing, helped with homework, and even arranged Spanish lessons for him. His schedule was packed. The day he was praised by his teacher for his rapid improvement, he jumped up and cheered for me. He posted 10 updates on social media declaring that he could be a genius too. At that moment, I realized. It wasn't my teaching methods that were the problem. It was because Emily didn't like me that I seemed to be wrong in everything I did. With that answer in mind, my connection with Kevin was about to end. When I was packing up his things, he walked in, excited. He said, "Mr. Johnson, let's go to this comic convention. The cosplayers we both like will be there." His smile froze when he noticed what I was holding in my hands. His voice trembled as he asked, "Mr. Johnson, what are you planning to do?" I calmly replied, "You're not my son, so I can't keep taking care of you. You should go back now." Before I could finish, Robert's anxious voice came from outside the door. He shouted, "George, give my son back to me." Kevin's face changed, and he quickly opened the door. The first thing I saw was Robert standing at the door. His hair was messy and greasy, his eyes red, and the buttons of his shirt were all misaligned. He looked disheveled, completely unlike the elegant and composed person I used to know. Kevin, perhaps seeing him in such a state for the first time, was startled and took a few steps back. Robert, however, grabbed him and said, "Kevin, come home with Dad." Kevin turned coldly and replied, "Aren't you the one who loves Emily the most? Go take care of her. I'm doing fine here. It's a lot better than being with you. Yesterday the teacher praised my progress in studies. Looks like I'm not as bad at learning as you said." Robert furrowed his brows, looking like he was about to explode, just like I did when Emily pissed me off in the past. He gritted his teeth and said, "No, you're my son, Kevin. You have to come back with me. Our lives will get better. You'll have a mom, too." Kevin suddenly exploded like a firecracker. He shouted, "Don't talk to me about Sarah. I hate her. She's not my mom. She will never be my mom." This was true. In the past life, although Sarah was fond of Robert, she treated Kevin poorly. The two of them were like fire and water, and Kevin argued with Robert countless times because of this stepmother. After their marriage, Kevin rarely went to visit Robert, while my cheap daughter often went to visit him. At this moment, Robert snarled, "You've been fooled by George. Don't listen to his nonsense. Come back with me now. Don't make me beat you." Kevin forcefully shoved his hand away, disgust clearly written on his face. I pulled at the corner of my mouth and smiled, saying, "It's getting late. Please leave, both of you. I've already sold this house and the new owner is coming soon." Kevin panicked and grabbed me, asking, "Dad, where are you going? Take me with you." Robert suddenly swung a punch, hitting Kevin and knocking him back. Robert shouted, "I'm your dad, you ungrateful little brat!" Kevin was stunned from the punch, but quickly pushed him off and ran outside. A familiar scene pulled me back to the lonely and miserable life of my past. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the bright spring sunshine outside the window greeted me. Thankfully, everything was over. The day before the end of the divorce cooling-off period was Emily's birthday. Sarah sent me dozens of messages urging me to come back, saying that if I didn't, she wouldn't go through with the divorce. When I arrived, Emily was unwrapping a gift from Robert. It was a necklace worth a lot of money. Emily jumped up, her eyes full of affection. Sarah's gaze softened when she looked at Robert, and she said, "I've wronged you these days. You really still care about Emily." My father-in-law also nodded at him. Money was indeed a powerful thing. It so easily bought people's hearts. Suddenly, everyone turned to look at me. They all asked, "George, where's your gift?" Emily muttered, "What kind of gift can he possibly buy? He's so cheap." She said this, but I noticed her frequently glancing behind me, as if expecting something. I remembered that during the days when I was taking care of Kevin, she had sent me some messages. The gist was that I was an irresponsible father, not taking care of my own daughter, and instead raising someone else's child. I ignored her at the time. I directly followed her words and admitted, I knew Emily wouldn't like the gift I'd buy, so I didn't buy anything. Everyone's expression changed, and Emily's face was full of resentment. Robert looked surprised. seemingly not expecting me to miss this opportunity to flatter Emily. Sarah immediately pulled me aside and asked, "What's wrong with you? It's Emily's birthday and you didn't buy her a gift? Do you really want a divorce?" I coldly looked at her and then laughed out loud. I asked, "What, do you think I'm just pretending?" Her pupils widened and she bit her lip, saying, "George, you wouldn't have a mistress, would you?" I shrugged and replied, "Don't try to play the victim here. I'm not buying it. You know exactly what your intentions are. I don't have time to discuss this. Just get the divorce done." She pressed her lips together and said, "George, actually, we don't need to go this far. Over the past few weeks, I've thought a lot. You've always treated me well. You're the best person for me. As for Robert, I've seen through him. He has his flaws, too. I don't want to start over with someone else. And besides, Emily is our daughter. Robert's presence won't change anything. You should be more generous. Don't care so much. Just think of it as having an extra guy to help raise our daughter. How nice is that?" I was speechless. I felt like I was about to crack. I pinched the bridge of my nose and said, "You must be out of your mind. What nonsense are you talking about? So you want me to work my ass off outside, earn money to support you and Robert's carefree life, right?" She said, "I didn't mean it like that." I replied, "It doesn't matter what you meant. I really don't care about hearing your nonsense." I turned to leave. She suddenly grabbed my sleeve and said, "Fine, I promise I'll cut ties with Robert." I pried her hand off and said, "Get lost." The next second, Emily suddenly burst in, pointing at me. "Mom, why are you trying to keep him? Robert was so good to me. I want him to be my dad, not you. Let's go." Sarah looked at me deeply, and in a soft voice, she said, "George, why do you always play hard to get? You know you still love me." I immediately gave her the middle finger. Robert stood a short distance away, his eyes swirling with stormy waves. He quickly pushed a bicycle over and smiled at Emily, trying to please her. "Emily, I also got you a bicycle. You can ride this one for now. If it's uncomfortable, I'll buy you a better one." Emily smiled and reached out to take the bike. A gust of wind swept past me. I didn't know when, but Kevin had been hiding outside and overhearing. He suddenly rushed in, grabbed the bike, and began inspecting it. Emily grew anxious and tried to take it back, saying, "This is my bike! Give it back!" Kevin, who was taller and more muscular than Emily, shoved her aside with a press of his chest. He said, "Get out of the way, you crazy girl!" Robert saw his hard-earned relationship with his son was about to be destroyed, and quickly spoke up. "What's wrong with you, kid? Dad will buy you a bike soon." Kevin replied, "No." Kevin was extremely agitated, his words spitting out in anger, spraying Robert's face. His eyes were bloodshot, and he screamed in fury, "All you care about is this woman and this crazy girl. There's no place for me in your life. I don't want to live anymore. Let you have your peace." He tossed the bike aside, pulled a knife from his pocket, and slashed it across his arm. Dark red blood flowed from his wound, horrifying to see. Robert completely broke down, falling to his knees, pleading with Kevin to stop. He shouted, Son, why can't you understand? Please stop!" Kevin, already beyond reason, laughed maniacally, slashing another cut across his arm. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sort of desperate hope, as if waiting for me to say something to stop him. Robert noticed this and turned to beg me, kneeling down. "Mr. Johnson, please, you have to talk to Kevin. He always talks about you when he's back. He says I'm not as good as you at being a dad. Please, say something. Mr. Johnson, I'm begging you." He completely abandoned his pride and started furiously kowtowing to me. He said, I was wrong. It was all my fault before. I was shameless, trying to take your family's inheritance. I was despicable. Please, Mr. Johnson, save my son. He's the only son I have." Before I could speak, Emily interrupted. She said, "None of you are allowed to talk him out of it. You're my real dad, and you're my future stepdad. You're all my dads, and you're not allowed to take sides." Robert's eyes narrowed. and in a flash of anger, he slapped Emily, making her mouth twist to the side. Robert cursed. "Shut up! If the Garcia family ends with me, I'll take your life." Sarah, hearing this, immediately pulled Emily behind her, frowning with anger. She said, "Why is your son acting like this? Why are you hitting my daughter? How come I never noticed you had violent tendencies?" Robert's emotions were already shattered. He slapped Sarah across the face with a resounding sound and roared, "Hitting you is too light! Do you see what's happening to my son? What nonsense are you talking about? For months I've been putting up with you two, and you still got the nerve to get uppity? Do you think I want to be a sucker? If it weren't for your family's money, I'd have slapped you both 100 times by now." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief as she asked, "Mr. Garcia, you're not serious, are you?" Robert gritted his teeth and said, "Serious? Who would want someone like you, a kid who even rejects her own father?" The room fell silent. Robert, in a panic, turned to Kevin and tried to grab the knife from his hands. I sighed and extended my hand toward Kevin, saying, "Kevin, give me the knife, and go with your dad to bandage your wound." His nostrils flared, his eyes quickly filling with tears. The next second, he did something I never expected. The knife, already almost in my hand, was suddenly pulled back with astonishing speed, shocking everyone in the room. The sky was silent, except for Robert's piercing, endless cries. Kevin died at the age of 13. No one knew what he was thinking in his final moments. I vaguely remembered, in my previous life, when I was lying in the hospital bed, waiting for death. He came to see me once. In my past life, he had always looked down on me and treated me with disdain. But when I was near death, he was the only one who visited. At that time, he had already been living abroad for many years, and only came back during holidays. But that day, he crossed oceans and mountains, walked into a small hospital room, and said to me, "I'm sorry." His words were soft, but I still heard them clearly. That was the real reason I took him in. Robert developed a severe mental illness and stayed in the hospital for a long time. After being discharged, he disappeared for several days. At this time, Sarah suddenly came to me. She brought Emily with her and looked at me earnestly. She said, "Honey, let's start over. From now on, it'll just be the three of us in this house." Emily hesitated, then said to me, "Dad, I miss you. Please come home. I'll listen to you from now on." I let out a helpless laugh. I said, "If you won't cooperate with the divorce, then let's go to court. I have plenty of time." Emily cried and rushed over to grab my arm. She said, "Dad, I was wrong. You're the person who loves me most in this world. Don't leave me. I'll listen. I'll be good. I won't look down on you anymore." I took a deep breath and coldly looked at her, and in my ear I could almost hear the words she once said in the past life. She had said, "At our age, why bother with treatment? You might as well just die." At the thought of this, I sneered, shook her hand off, and walked away without hesitation. They didn't give up. They pestered me for over a month. Wherever I went, I could hear their apologies. Just as I was about to file for divorce, Sarah told me she had agreed to it. I didn't ask her why the sudden change of heart. I signed the papers swiftly and ended that disgusting relationship. I changed all my contact information and moved to a small city in the north to begin my life of early retirement. One afternoon, my mother told me that Sarah had fallen and become disabled. Apparently, while cleaning the windows, she had accidentally fallen down the stairs and became permanently disabled. My mother also said that Emily, unable to find me, often went to her to complain. She said Sarah's agreement to divorce had a reason. On that day, Robert suddenly appeared. He finally tricked Sarah into bed, and afterward he kneeled to apologize, promising he would treat her and Emily well after marriage. Sarah believed him, so she agreed to divorce me. But after Robert married her, He appeared to be a loving, doting husband in public. Behind closed doors, however, he skillfully applied psychological pressure on Emily. He crushed her spirit, making her doubt her own worth. Even when Emily made progress in her studies, he would say with disappointment, "I thought you could do better." Many people couldn't understand why. Although he seemed to treat Emily so well, the child seemed to live in an environment where neither father nor mother cared for her. I smiled. That's the brilliance of Robert. He was a master of psychological control. Now, with Sarah's legs broken and Emily still in her first year of middle school, their struggles were far from over.